He woke to the sound of someone breathing too carefully. Not sleeping. Not resting. The specific, controlled rhythm of a person who had learned that even breathing cost something, and had decided to spend it as slowly as possible. The ceiling above him was low, smoked black from years of a fire that had never been large enough to properly warm the room. Between the warped beams, pale frost clung to the wood in thin crystalline lines. His cheek was pressed against something rough, a sack stuffed with old straw, flat with age, the filling shifted entirely to one end. His coat was still on. Someone had added a second layer over him, a piece of stiff felt, hard as board. He blinked. Memory did not return as a single wave. It came the way water fills a cracked vessel, slowly, from the bottom up. A city. A hospital room. His own chest that had stopped working in the orderly, documented manner of a man in his 30s in the 21st century. Then nothing. The standard nothing that was supposed to be permanent. And then this ceiling. He turned his head. 6 pairs of eyes looked back at him. The nearest pair belonged to a girl of about 8. She sat on the edge of the plank he was lying on, knees drawn to her chest, her face the color of old linen, not the pallor of a cold room but the flat, used-up gray of a body that had already begun making decisions about which functions to maintain. Her cheekbones pressed outward through skin that had nothing underneath it anymore. She was watching him with the steady attention of someone who had been watching for a long time and had stopped expecting anything particular to happen. Behind her, pressed against the wall under a single shared cloth, 2 smaller children sat without moving. A boy, perhaps 5. A girl younger. Their faces were still in the way that children's faces become still when the energy for expression is gone. 3 women sat further back. The eldest, perhaps 30, with the same angle of jaw he recognized without understanding how, sat upright on a low bench with her hands folded. No panic. Panic required fuel she no longer had. The second woman was thinner, sharper, holding a small child whose head lolled with the specific looseness of deep exhaustion. The third woman sat slightly apart, her eyes moving to the door every few seconds. 3 women. 6 children. 1 cold stove. He sat up slowly. The hollow ache in his body was real, the exact, specific weight of prolonged starvation, familiar in concept and entirely new as lived sensation. His arms held. His legs would hold. Already more than he had a right to expect. Appa. The eldest woman said it almost without sound. Just breath shaped into the word. Brother. You hear me? Yes, he said. His voice came out lower than expected, rougher. She nodded once. The nod of someone filing a fact. He looked at the room and read it the way he had learned, in another life, to read terrain before moving through it. The stove, wide, brick, should have been capable of heating the entire space. The ash bed was thin. 1 ember glowed through the grate, the size of a closed fist, covered carefully with ash to stretch it through the night. No wood stacked beside it. None anywhere in the room. The chest in the corner, lid slightly open, visibly empty. Not recently emptied, empty long enough that even the smell of grain had left the wood. On the table, a clay bowl with the pale residue of something that had been liquid and was now just a dried ring at the edge. Under the window, a jug. Less than a quarter full. How much food is in this house? He asked. The youngest woman flinched. The eldest answered, flour. Maybe 40 grams. She glanced at the thin woman, who confirmed it with a small nod. Maybe less. He ran the arithmetic without moving his face. 8 people. 40 grams. 5 grams each. Less than a spoonful. For today, he said. For the last meal. There is no next one unless, she stopped. Unless nothing followed. She had stopped because there was nothing that followed. Water in the well? The youngest woman answered, her eyes still moving toward the door. Yes. But it's far. Sua tried to carry it yesterday. She fell on the way back. She glanced at the small girl in the corner, who pulled her shoulders slightly inward. He filed it. Water exists, but the route costs more energy than the family currently has to spend. The forest, he said. Which direction? The eldest studied him with a new quality, not grief, not hope, something more careful. Past the river. 2 li, maybe. There's a copse. People don't go too far when you're running on nothing. Everyone goes to the collective road instead. 4 straw. A ravine? Low ground, gullies, anything hidden from the main road? The girl, the 8-year-old who had been watching him, spoke before the women could. Behind the hill at the north end. There's an old gully. The boys used to go there. Her voice was small but exact. Nobody goes now. He looked at her. She looked back without dropping her eyes. Good, he said. That's useful. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite surprise. The recognition of a word she had not heard recently. He stood. The room tilted once and steadied. He breathed through it. He looked at the room one more time, this time for inventory rather than orientation. On the windowsill, a small folding knife, left there with the specific carelessness of something set down by someone too tired to put it away properly. On the wall, 2 nails with fabric, old garments, too worn for warmth, kept for reasons not yet clear. In the box near the stove, 3 spools of thread, 2 needles, a strip of rough twine, a length of cracked leather. He took the twine. Ran it between his fingers. Strong enough for what he needed tonight. I'm going out, he said. 1 hour. 2 at most. The eldest woman, Hyunja, started to rise. Her legs shook with the effort and she steadied herself against the table's edge. You were barely alive 3 days ago. And now I'm standing. He kept his voice level, not cold, not warm. The register of a mechanic explaining a process. If I go looking for food without mapping the ground first, I'll burn more energy than I'll find. Today I don't hunt. Today I read. Where animals move. Where other people have already cleared. Where I can move without being seen. Silence. The girl spoke again. Like a hunter, she said. Exactly like a hunter. He looked at the thin woman, the one with the needle-fine fingers and the worn patches at her sleeves that spoke of someone who spent long hours with her hands in cloth. Is there more twine? Wire. Anything flexible and strong? She brought the box. He took the twine and the leather strip. Left the thread. Don't use the thread for anything until I tell you. The thread is worth more than it looks. She nodded, absorbing this without asking why. He addressed the room one last time. Don't open the door while I'm gone. Anyone. Keep the children on the stove. Whatever you were planning to trade, he looked at the youngest woman, whose hand moved instinctively to her collar where something no longer hung. Don't. You'll get 1 bowl of something rotten for it. After that you'll have nothing left to trade and nothing to eat. Her jaw tightened. She looked away. He went out. The village street in daylight was a narrow strip of gray mud ice between low huts, the color of the sky, the color of the faces visible in doorways. No dogs. No cats. No birds near the ground. Everything easy had already been eaten weeks ago. He walked at the pace of a man with nowhere to go, slightly forward in the shoulders, gaze down, step short. The walk of someone with nothing. In an environment where every moving figure was assessed by every watching eye, purposeful movement was its own kind of announcement. At the field edge, past the last huts, he crouched at the base of a broken fence post. Tracks. 4-toed, narrow, with a tail drag. Not a rat, the stride too long, the placement too deliberate. He set 2 fingers beside the impression. Hair, or something close. 3 days old, perhaps less. The animal had come from the direction of the northern copse, followed the fence line, and turned back before the village. It had come close and decided against it. Hunger was pushing it toward human ground. That was useful. He did not follow the track. He memorized the direction and moved on. The gully behind the northern hill was exactly as the girl had described, a long, shallow cut in the earth, hidden from the main road by a rise in the overgrown edge of an old embankment. At the bottom, standing water, half frozen. Animal tracks in the soft mud at the water's edge, hair again, and smaller prints. bird, fin-toed, within the last day. He stood at the top of the gully and scanned without entering. The far wall had exposed roots where the bank had eroded, natural cover, natural concealment. An animal coming to water would come directly past those roots. A snare placed there would be invisible from above. He did not set anything. He noted the location, marked 2 approach angles that avoided the sightlines from the road, and turned back. He returned in under 2 hours. The cold had settled into his hands by then, but his mind was running cleanly. Inside, nothing had changed. The children still on the stove. The women still positioned where he'd left them. The jug still quarter full. He sat at the table. "Tomorrow," he said, "to the room, I need one thing from each of you before I sleep." He looked at Hyunja. "You count everything in this house. Not just food. Everything: cloth, cord, nails, glass, leather. Hold it in your head. I need to know what we have." He looked at the thin woman Unseo, the needle-fingered one. "Tonight, braid the twine I took. Double it. Tight. Every joint under pressure." He looked at the youngest, Mireille, the one who watched the door. "You tell me tomorrow who watches which houses. Who reports. Who talks too much. Think about it tonight." He looked at the girl. "You, the short way to the well. Show me tomorrow. Before full light." She held his gaze. Then nodded once, with the gravity of someone accepting a role she had already decided she could fill. He sat back and looked at the 8 faces in the room. 40 grams. 1/4 jug of water. 6 children. 3 women running on reserves that were nearly spent. And one mind that knew the difference between a panicked search for food and a patient, invisible system for producing it. First snares tomorrow. Small targets. Multiple locations. Never the same path twice. Never bring anything to the door that leaves a trace. The ember in the stove still glowed. He watched it for a moment. Enough to last the night. Not enough to make smoke someone else can read. That was the rule for everything that came next. Enough to survive. Not enough to be seen. He was up before the light. Not gradually, not with the reluctance of a cold body warming toward consciousness. He came awake completely, all at once, already listening, the way he had trained himself in another life during long hunts when the margin between finding the animal and missing it was a matter of which one moved first. The hut was dark except for the faint orange thread at the base of the stove grate. Still alive. He had banked it before sleeping, ash over coal, just enough to hold the ember through the night without producing the column of smoke that read from the outside as, "Someone here is warmer than they should be." The girl was already sitting up when he moved. He had not heard her wake. She had simply been asleep, and then she was not, and she was watching him with those steady eyes that had decided, sometime in the first hour after he returned yesterday, that he was worth watching carefully. He put one finger to his lips. She nodded. They went out before anyone else stirred. The well path in pre-dawn dark was different from its daytime version, quieter, but more than that, the shapes changed. The collapsed shed became a different silhouette. The fence line became a different mark against the sky. He walked at once, mapping, then let her lead. The girl, Suwa, moved well. She placed her feet where the mud was frozen rather than where it was soft, without being told, instinctively. He noted this. It would matter later. The well was a hand-dug shaft with a rotting frame and a bucket on a rope so frayed at the critical point that someone had wrapped it with cloth. The water came up dark in the low light but cleared when it settled. He sniffed it. Mineral, faintly metallic. No rot. He filled the jug she'd brought, then checked the approach from 3 angles, reading sightlines to the nearest huts. One window had a direct view of the well. On the way back he took a route that arced behind the old woodshed, keeping its bulk between them and that window. 3 minutes longer. Worth 3 minutes. The first snares went into the ground in the hour after they returned, before full daylight. Unseo had braided the twine through the night. He could see it in her hands when he lifted the cloth, tight and even, the joints solid. He tested it against his thumbs. Not perfect. Enough. He went to the gully. 3 snares on the most used animal run at the water's edge, not clustered, spaced at the intervals he'd paced the day before, each on a separate approach line. He set each one low, the loop no larger than 2 fists, anchored to the exposed root system of the gully wall. A trigger twig across each entrance, light enough that the weight of a hair would spring it, firm enough to hold against wind. 2 more snares at the copse, in the untouched center where human footprint had not been. He set these differently, higher loop, trigger placed across a gap between 2 root masses where something larger might push through. He came back to the village without using the main road. He cut through the edge of the empty collective field, keeping to the frozen furrow lines, pausing twice when figures moved at the far end of the street. He waited each time until they were gone. At the house threshold he wiped his boots on the grass and cleaned his hands before touching the door handle. First rule of an invisible supply system: don't carry the forest into the room. The foraging run was the part he had been thinking through since the night before. Snares took time. You set them and came back. What he needed immediately was caloric material that didn't require waiting. He took Hyunja, the eldest sister, tall, bone-thin, with the controlled economy of someone who had been managing a household in crisis long enough that crisis had become a management style, and they went to the river bank together. He did not explain what they were looking for until they arrived. Then he showed her. Under the ice crust at the river's shallow edge, caught in the root tangles of the overhanging bank, freshwater snails. Small, dark-shelled, cold dormant. He worked a dozen free with a stick, turned them over in his palm, then moved 6 feet and showed her where to look, always in root tangles, always at the water-mud interface, always where the current was slowest. She watched once, then began working alongside him without further instruction. Her hands were methodical, unbothered by cold in the way hands become unbothered when they have been cold for a long time. 40 minutes. 81 snails in the cloth bag. What else? She said. Not, what are these for? Just, what next? He showed her the cattail stands at the river bend. The stalks were dead and brown above the waterline, but at the base, where the rhizome anchored below the frost line, the root material was still dense and starchy. He dug 3 up with the knife and cut the root sections free, passed her one to feel the weight. You dry these and pound them, he said quietly. Not flour, but close enough when you mix it with water. It binds. It holds. She turned the root in her hands. My grandmother, she began. Then stopped. Then, I thought it was old talk. It works, he said. It isn't pleasant. It works. He also showed her the inner bark layer of the 3 birch trees at the cemetery edge, the pale, soft cambium layer just beneath the rough outer bark, which northern peoples across many centuries had eaten in hard seasons because it contained enough caloric value to matter. He showed her how to cut only a narrow strip from each tree, never the full ring. The tree was a future resource. She repeated that back to him when he said it. Not to show understanding. To fix it in place. On the return, he paused at the road drainage pool where the ditch water collected at the village edge. Partly frozen, but the unfrozen center held surface insects, water beetles, suspended organic sediment. He stripped a thin branch to a point, dragged the surface. Insects collected on the tip. She looked at the branch tip for a long moment. For the soup, she said. For the soup, he confirmed. Back at the house, he called all 3 sisters and the older children to the table. The youngest 2 he kept on the stove. Their energy was too low to spend on information they couldn't yet act on, and he needed what little reserve they had going toward heat retention and basic tissue repair. He laid everything on the cleared table, the bag of snails, the cattail roots, the strips of birch cambium, the beetles in a small jar from the shelf. This is today, he said. Here is what you do with it, in what order, and in what quantities. He looked at Hyunja. You manage the cook. Everything goes into one pot. Boil the snails first, 15 minutes minimum, then pull the meat. Small pieces, less than a finger width per shell. Save every piece. Save the shells. Don't throw the shells. She nodded, not asking why about the shells. She was already past the point of asking why about things that were clearly deliberate. The cattail root goes in after the snails. Pound it first with the back of the knife handle until it breaks. Not mush, just broken open. It will release starch into the water. The water itself becomes food. He looked at Uneseo. You take the birch strips and dry them flat on top of the stove, not inside, on top. When they're dry, scrape the inner soft layer off with the knife. Set it aside separately. That's tomorrow's edition. He looked at Mireille, the youngest sister, the one who watched the door. You watch today. Not outside. Through the window gap. Anyone who stops near this house more than once, you tell me. Sit beside the window, not in front of it. Look sideways. She absorbed this with the specific alertness of someone who had already been doing a version of it without knowing she was supposed to. He looked at Sua. The path to the well this morning. That's the path now. Every time, that route. Not the direct road. Always the long way behind the woodshed. Because of the window, she said immediately. Because of the window, he confirmed. She filed it the way she filed everything, completely, without visible effort, as if the information had found a prepared slot and dropped into it cleanly. He looked at the small boy Jiho, the one who had fallen carrying water 2 days ago, who had been sitting quietly at the table's edge following the conversation with the focused attention of a child waiting to be included. You know the short path to the river? Through the back of the yard 2 houses over? A small, careful nod. Show me tomorrow. Not today. Today you eat and rest. Save the energy. Something moved briefly in the boy's face, something that was almost normal. The expression of a child who had been given a task instead of a verdict. The soup was ready in the early afternoon. Hyunja had done it correctly. The broth was thin, gray-brown, with small flecks of snail meat and the faint starchy cloud of dissolved cattail root. The smell was almost nothing vegetal, damp, the specific odor of food that appeared to contain almost no food. That was right. Smell was information, and this smell said, nothing here worth noticing. He waited until all 8 were positioned, seated at the table, or settled on the stove, then divided it. Equal portions. He said this before he served. He said the reason too. I know the weakest person feels like they need the most. But if you give everything to the weakest, the people doing the work get too weak to work. Then there's nothing tomorrow. We eat equally. We produce together. That's how this holds. No one argued. No one asked for more. The children ate with the mechanical focus of people for whom eating was no longer pleasure but function. The youngest boy on the stove, Pavlo, who had been unable to lift his head 3 days ago, finished his portion. Slowly. But finished it. He noted this in the only ledger that mattered. After the meal, he brought the pot back to the stove and addressed Hyunja directly. Don't clean the pot between meals. The residue on the sides goes back into the next cook. Tomorrow I'll add to the base. She looked at the pot. At him. The expression of someone hearing a thing they immediately recognize they should have already known. The bones, he added. When we have bones, and we will have bones within 2 days, you boil them twice. First boil pulls most of the collagen. Second boil pulls what the first one misses. Before the second boil, you crack them with the knife handle and let the marrow dissolve directly into the water. The fat is the most valuable part. You never skim it. You never waste it. You cook with it twice before you consider it spent. The fat, she repeated quietly, as if making a note. The fat, he said. In a famine, fat is the one thing the body can't replace from anything else. Carbohydrate you can build from roots and bark. Protein you can build from small animals and insects. Fat has no substitute. Every gram of it is a gram that keeps a brain working when everything else has failed. She looked at him for a moment with the particular expression she had developed over the past 2 days, not gratitude, not quite the expression of someone who had been running a damaged machine for months and had just been handed the maintenance manual. He spent the last hour of daylight at the copse. In the hidden center, behind the thorn bush, he drove 2 forked sticks into the ground at shoulder height and ran a crossbar between them. A drying rack. Low enough to be covered by the surrounding undergrowth, invisible from the approach unless you knew the specific entry angle. He wove the overhead branch cover back together at the top until the gap was closed. He stood back and looked at it. You could not see it, even knowing it was there. This was where the meat would be processed. Not at the house. The house was for eating. The cups was for producing. The two functions needed to be separated by the maximum viable distance, because the smell that came from producing was the smell that invited inspection, and inspection was the thing the system could not survive. He walked back to the village as the light went fully gray, through the long route, past the frozen field, entering through the back fence gap. Inside, the children were settled. The stove ember was still alive. Unesio held up the braided cord she'd been working on all day, a longer piece now, tighter than last night's, the joints tested and trimmed. "Is this right?" she asked. He took it, ran it through his fingers, pulled it at the weakest point. "That's right," he said. "Make more. Every evening. Whatever material we have." She nodded and went back to it immediately, her hands moving in the low light with the practiced ease of someone returning to a known task, her fingers finding the rhythm without needing to think about it. The first chain was running. Snares in the ground. Drying rack hidden. Routes established. Roles assigned. Pot on the stove with something in it that had been built from a system rather than found by luck. Tomorrow the snares would be checked. The chain would either hold its next link or it would not. If it did not, he would adjust the placement, change the approach, find the gap in his reading of the terrain and correct it, and check again the day after. That was the whole method. Not a miracle. Not a single large action that solved everything. A chain. One link at a time. Each link tested before the next one was added. He sat on the edge of the plank and listened to the breathing in the room, all 8 of them, all still present, the rhythm of it slightly less careful than it had been this time yesterday. The stove ember glowed. He closed his eyes and started planning the morning. The first snare had been sprung and was empty. He found it at first light on the 3rd day, crouching at the gully's edge where the root tangle met the waterline. The loop had closed, but on nothing living. Or rather, on something that had been living and was no longer there. The twine was intact, the trigger mechanism in place, but the ground around the snare told the real story, 2 sets of human footprints overlapping the animal track he'd been reading. One set coming in. One set going out, with the deeper heel impression of someone carrying weight on the return. He stayed crouched for a long time. The prints were not fresh. 12 hours, maybe more, which meant someone had come in the night, found the snare triggered, found the animal inside it, taken the animal, and reset nothing. They had not reset it because they didn't know how, or because they were too hungry to think about tomorrow, or because tomorrow had stopped feeling like a real place some weeks ago. Probably all 3. The second snare, empty, unsprung, untouched. The third, the same. He moved to the copse. In the copse center the drying rack was undisturbed. The hidden entry was still hidden. But the first snare at the root mass had been pulled entirely, twine gone, stakes yanked from the ground, the disturbance in the soil, the disturbance of hands working quickly in low light. Someone had not been able to spring it for an animal. They had taken the materials themselves. Cord, wire, anything that could become a snare or a lashing or a shoe patch was worth more here than almost anything money could still buy. He sat at the copse edge and ran the accounting. 5 snares placed. 1 sprung and cleaned. 1 stripped entirely. 3 intact. The tracks told him at least 2 different people, different shoe sizes, different gait depths, had been through the area within the past day. People who had not been here before, now expanding their range as their reserves ran lower. Desperation had its own expanding radius. He went back to the house without retracing his route. Hyunjo was awake when he left and awake when he returned. He was beginning to understand she slept very little, and that this was not a choice but a silent appointment she had made with herself. The household needed someone alert, and she had decided it would be her. He sat at the table and told her everything. He had learned in 2 days that partial information was less useful than complete information. She processed without drama, which was the most efficient quality a person could have in an emergency. The snare by the water, she said. How long before it caught something? 2 days. So they work. They work. The problem is that other people are finding them. A pause. Because we're all looking at the same ground, she said. Exactly. Everyone in the village with enough energy to walk was reading the same geometry: the river, the copse, the drainage pools at the road edge. Every snare placed in obvious terrain was a snare in direct competition with every other hungry person thinking the same thoughts. "We need to go further than anyone else will go," he said. "And stop going where they go. Further costs more energy. Which is why we eat something before going out. Every time. Even a spoonful of the base broth. You don't send the machine out cold." She absorbed this. Filed it without comment. He laid out the changes he was going to make. By midday, all 3 remaining snares had been relocated. Not just off the obvious paths, genuinely repositioned to places that required knowing the terrain to find. There was a small marsh drainage gully he'd identified that morning, 200 meters further than anyone from the village appeared to have walked recently. Reaching it required a long arc past the cemetery and a crossing of a frozen drainage channel that was uncomfortable in the cold. That discomfort was the point. Severely depleted people chose the nearest viable option. The uncomfortable route was, by that logic, the protected route. He distributed the snares across 4 distinct locations. 2 at the marsh gully, placed at the meltwater edge where the ground was soft enough to show tracks clearly. 1 at the base of a dense reed stand at the river's far bend, placed underwater at the margin, where waterfowl moved in the early morning cold. 1 at a new burrow he'd found, the displaced soil fresh enough that something was still using it actively. 4 locations. No 2 visible from the same point. No 2 reachable by the same approach. Then he went back to the 2 positions that had been raided and he cleared them completely. Pulled his own stakes. Filled the depressions. Scattered dead leaves across the disturbed soil. Removed every sign that anyone had ever set anything there. If the people who had raided those locations returned, they would find nothing and move on. If they concluded the area had been worked out and stopped coming, better still. Dead ground was safe ground. The first rail catch came that evening. He checked the marsh gully in the last gray light, approaching from the eastern arc to avoid the sightlines from the village road, and found the second snare closed on a hare. Young or starved thin, probably both, but intact, the neck clean, the body still warm. He held it for one moment. Not joy. Something more precise than joy: recognition. The system had produced an output. The chain had turned its second link. He did not go back to the house. He carried the hare further into the marsh edge, to a low hollow behind a stand of dead reeds, and he worked there for 20 minutes in the fading light. His hands knew the process without needing his mind to direct them. Slit the belly without puncturing the gut. Remove the organs in sequence: stomach and intestines set aside, heart and liver kept. Work the pelt back from the hindquarters first, up and over, keeping it in one clean piece. Collect the blood that pooled in the body cavity by tilting the carcass and catching it in the small clay dish he'd carried specifically for this purpose. Nothing discarded. This was not sentiment, it was arithmetic. Every gram of discarded material was a gram of caloric recovery not made. The gut and stomach he buried in the marsh mud below the frost line. Smell at the surface was information freely given. Smell below frozen ground was smell contained. The pelt he rolled fur inward and pressed against his body inside the coat. Warmth kept it pliable. Stiffened pelt was harder to work. It had used as insulation, cord, raw material for Unesio's hands, but first it needed to arrive at the house without being visible from the outside. He walked back in the dark through the long route. At the door he stopped, listened to the village. Quiet in the way it had become quiet, the absence of energy rather than the presence of sleep. He went inside. He gathered the 3 sisters in the corner furthest from the door, speaking low while the children slept. First rule. No one smells this cook from outside. We used the existing fire window, small flame, short time, pot covered. If the smell builds inside, we open the door for 30 seconds and close it. Never longer. The children will smell it even before they wake, Mireille said quietly. Yes. And they eat their portion and sleep again. But they don't talk about it tomorrow. Not to each other, not outside. This is the second rule. He looked at Hyunja. You tell them tonight, before they eat. Not harshly. Clearly. What we eat in this house we found in the field. Old root. Tough grass. We are barely managing. That is what we say. Hyunja's expression did not change. Not because people are enemies, he added. I understand what you mean, she said. Flat, direct. She did understand. Third rule. The bones from this cook, crack them before the second boil. Let the marrow dissolve into the water. The second boil pulls what the first misses. Nothing gets thrown away until it has been used twice. He laid the hair on the table and divided it before cooking. He did not cook the whole animal. He cooked the front section, the rib cage, the organs, the blood mixed into the broth water. The hindquarters, the densest muscle, he wrapped in cloth and carried to the corner where he'd prepared the cache that afternoon. The floorboard in the far corner near the wall rot, he'd worked it loose earlier, deepened the natural hollow beneath it, lined it with dry cloth to keep the meat off the damp soil, packed clay around the access point. He pressed the wrapped hindquarters into the hollow and replaced the board. First cache. Not the full supply. The first principle of distributed storage, any single point could be found, and what could be found could be taken. Is it safe there? Nire asked, watching. Safer than in the pot. If someone comes and smells a full cook, they know there's more. If they find half a cook and search the house, they find nothing else. They leave believing they found everything. She looked at the floorboard for a moment. Then, you think about this very differently from how we think. Differently from whom? From everyone here. From how we think. Not criticism. Observation. He gave her the honest answer. I had access to more information. About how things like this work. That's all it is. The soup that night held meat. Not rich. Not what anyone in another time would call adequate. But there was protein in the broth, liver and heart shredded fine, dissolved into the cattail base with the blood stirred in at the last moment, and when the children ate it, something changed in the room. Not visible. Felt. The specific, collective exhale of bodies held at maximum tension for long enough that even a marginal reduction of that tension registered as something close to relief. The youngest child on the stove finished his portion. Slowly. But he finished it. After the meal, after the children were settled, he stood at the window gap and looked at the street. 3 houses down, a lamp was on. Not firelight, lamp oil. Which meant that house had resources the others did not. He had noticed this lamp the first night. He had noticed it every night since. It went on at the same time and went out at the same time, the exact schedule of a person who measured their consumption deliberately. Nire appeared at his shoulder. Goryo's house, she said, her voice careful and even. The one with the lamp. His name is Bak Cheol-soo. He's the brigade accountant. A pause in which she chose her next words. He walks the village. Twice a day. Sometimes 3 times. He has a book. He writes things. Another pause. He came to our door the day before you woke up. Asked about you. Whether you were still alive. He kept his eyes on the lamp. What did you tell him? That you were sick. Fever. He believed you? She considered this honestly. He didn't disbelieve us. He looked at the children. He wrote something. He said he'd come back when you were better. The lamp went out. He let the cloth fall back over the window gap. He stood in the dark room with the faint residue of tonight's soup still in the air, very faint, managed correctly, no stronger than the smell of someone who had cooked something minimal and consumed it completely, and thought about a man who walked the village 3 times a day and noted things in a book. A man who had come to their door and looked at the children and said he would return. The system was still invisible. The snares were in terrain no one had been recently. The cache was under the floor. The drying rack was hidden in the copse. The cooking was low, covered, timed to the wind direction. From the outside, this house should still present as every other house in the village, diminishing, quiet, approaching the end at the expected pace. But Bak Cheol-soo walked 3 times a day, and men who walked 3 times a day were reading the village the way he read animal terrain, looking for the thing that didn't match the expected pattern. He had perhaps a week before Chiolsu noticed that this house was dying more slowly than it should. 1 week to get the system deep enough that it could survive a careful man's attention. He decided on the last rule that night, and he delivered it the next morning, quietly, to all 3 sisters together, before the children woke. The most dangerous information we carry is not what we have, he said. It's what our faces show when we have it. He looked at each of them. When you walk outside, your face shows what you feel. Right now, what you feel is slightly less desperate than yesterday. That is visible to someone looking for it. A woman who felt nothing yesterday and feels something today is a woman whose situation has changed. Changed situations get investigated. Hyunja was very still. So we practice showing nothing, he said. Not misery, misery is an expression too, and forced misery is obviously forced. Blank. Tired. The look of people who have stopped expecting anything. That look is the one that says, nothing here has changed. Mireille said quietly, we're already good at that look. You were, he said. You're not as good at it now as you were 3 days ago. Because 3 days ago you hadn't eaten anything real in a week. Now you have. The difference shows in the eyes. A long silence. Hyunja turned to the window and looked at her own reflection in the frost-clouded glass for a moment. He could not see what she saw there. Then she turned back. Show us what you mean, she said. He did. It took most of the morning. They practiced in the dim light of the hut, approaching the door, opening it, standing in the entrance the way they would stand when Bak Chiolsu came back. He watched each of them and told them what he saw, specifically and without softening it, because softening it was a luxury they could not afford. By midday, Hyunja had it. SEO was close. Mireille struggled, not because she wasn't trying, but because her particular form of fear expressed itself in the eyes in a way that was harder to suppress. He worked with her separately on the specific muscle around the eye socket, the place where the tail lived. He also taught the children. Not the youngest, they were too young to understand the instruction without understanding why, and understanding why would frighten them in a way that cost more than it gave. But Suwa understood. And Jito, the quiet boy with the river path, he understood faster than expected, his face going carefully, precisely neutral when asked to, holding it for a full minute without the micro-expressions that usually undermine the attempt. Good, he told Jiho. The boy held the expression for 1 more second, then let it go. What replaced it was something that was not quite pride, because pride required safety to grow in, and there was no safety here. But it was adjacent to pride. The expression of a person who has discovered a competence they did not know they had. That afternoon, Bak Chiolsu walked past the house. He did not stop. He walked at his usual pace, ledger under his arm, his gaze moving across each door and window in the way his gaze always moved, systematically, without appearing to. At their window, his pace did not change. He did not look toward the door any longer than he looked at any other door. He continued down the road and turned the corner at the end of the street. He did not come back for a second pass that day, which was unusual. He normally made 2. Which meant he was thinking about something. He stood at the window gap and watched the empty street where Chiolsu had been, and felt the specific quality of the next problem arriving on schedule, as problems did, not if, only when, and the when was already visible on the road. The system had kept them alive for 3 days. Bak Chiolsu was a man who made his living noticing when things that should be dying were not. The next phase was not about feeding the family. It was about learning to look, from the outside, exactly like a family that was dying. Bak Chiolsu came to the door on the 7th day, in the middle of the morning, without knocking. That was the first thing to understand about him. He did not knock because knocking implied the person inside had the right to decide whether to open. Chiolsu had moved past that convention long enough ago that he no longer remembered performing it. He simply opened doors, stepped inside, and arranged his face into the expression of a man conducting routine business, which was more insulting than open hostility because it communicated that you were not significant enough to warrant real menace. He was perhaps 45, built compactly, with the specific solidity of a man who had been adequately fed while the people around him were not. Not fat, nothing as obvious as that. Simply present in his body in a way that no one else in the village was present in theirs anymore. He wore a dark coat that had been good once and remained functional. The ledger was under his arm with the habitual ease of a tool that lived there. He looked at the room. The children on the stove. Hyunja standing at the table with her hands at her sides and her face arranged in the expression she had been practicing for 3 days. Then he looked at him. "The brother," he said. "Recovered." Not a question. "Recovered," he confirmed. Sheol-Su's gaze moved across him with the assessing quality of a man who dealt an inventory. Body weight. Muscle condition. The alertness behind the eyes, whether there was more of it than someone described as near death a week prior had any right to possess. He had prepared for this look. For 2 days he had been carrying himself with deliberate economy, moving slowly, shoulders slightly forward, his eyes holding the flat, unfocused quality of severe caloric depletion. Not a performance exactly. More like a partial recovery, deliberately managed, letting Sheol-Su see someone upright and breathing, but only marginally so. A man who had survived by the thinnest possible margin and was still running on the wrong side of that margin. Sheol-Su opened the ledger. Names. Ages. Working capacity. Hyunja gave them. All 8. She used the flat, cooperative register he had asked for, not servile, not resistant, the precise middle tone of someone with nothing to hide because there was nothing worth hiding. The children's ages. The women's status. His own, recovering, not yet at labor capacity, timeline uncertain. Sheol-Su wrote more than the answers warranted. Which meant he was also recording what he saw in the room. The stove. The chest. The jug. The absence of everything else. What are you eating? Still writing, not looking up. What we find, Hyunja said. Root. Grass. Whatever's left in the ground. You don't look as deteriorated as the house at the end of the road, Sheol-Su said. He said it conversationally, the way someone comments on weather. The grandmother there went 4 days ago. The son yesterday. He looked up from the ledger, directly at Hyunja. You still look functional. We rest more than we move, she said. Smart. He closed the ledger on his finger, holding the page. His eyes moved to the stove, to the pot sitting cold on top of it. May I? Not a question. He moved to the stove and lifted the lid. Inside, the cattail paste from that morning. Gray-brown, fibrous, the consistency of wet clay. The smell, waterlogged vegetation, almost no caloric signature, the specific odor of food that appeared to contain almost no food. He had managed the morning cook specifically for this, no meat residue, no fat on the surface, the broth water the color of old dishwater. Sheol-Su looked at it. Set the lid back. The chest. Hyunja opened it without being asked. Folded cloth. 2 thread spools. A broken wooden comb. The small knife. An empty ceramic jar. The chest of a household that had sold and consumed everything with value weeks ago. The floor cash was in the corner behind Sheol-Su's left shoulder. He did not look at the floor. People with authority rarely looked at floors. Floors were where dirt was, and men with ledgers were looking for things above floor level. Sheol-Su moved through the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this 6 days a week. He checked behind the stove, where people sometimes press small parcels into the gap between the brick and wall. He lifted the edge of the sleeping mat near the door. He pressed 2 fingers into the straw pallet where the children slept, feeling through the surface for anything solid inside. The children watched him. They had been told exactly how to watch him, without hostility, without fear, with the patient flat attention of people who had decided not to give the dog anything to react to. Sua's eyes were steady. Jiho's face was carefully, precisely neutral. He had practiced this more naturally than any of the adults. Even the youngest children on the stove simply watched, their expressions the expressions of children too tired for curiosity. The youngest boy, Pavlo, was asleep. His breathing was still shallow, but measurably less shallow than 4 days ago. The strip of dried hair dissolved into his evening water each night happened before the meal was served, before anyone was watching the portions. Sheol-Su stood in the room's center and assessed it as a complete picture. You have a man now, he said, addressing him rather than the women. Which changes the labor equation. When you reach working capacity, you'll be assigned to road clearing. East end of the main road, dawn to dusk. Report to the section leader. When I reach capacity, he said. Which I'll assess. Chiol-su's eyes were direct and without particular cruelty. This was the thing he was already understanding about the man. He was not sadistic. He was operational. The famine was a logistical problem and he was one of its logistical responses, and the fact that the logistical problem involved people dying was a variable he had processed long ago and filed under unavoidable operating conditions. I'll return in 5 days. If you're still at this level, we'll discuss lighter work. That's reasonable, he said. Chiol-su held him in his gaze for one additional moment, the specific moment where a man with careful eyes registers that the response he received was slightly more measured than the situation called for, slightly more composed than expected from someone who had been near death a week prior. Not suspicious enough to act on. Enough to file. Then he left. The door closed. Hyunja exhaled through her nose. Controlled. The exhale of someone who had been holding a specific tension for 20 minutes and was now releasing precisely the amount that was safe to release. He didn't find anything, she said. No, he said. But he noticed something. She looked at him. Not what we have. Just that we're more present than we should be. He'll come back in 5 days with sharper attention. He moved to the window gap. Outside, Chiol-su was already at the next house, moving with the same unhurried purpose. We have 5 days to make sure sharper attention finds the same thing he found today. He spent those 5 days expanding the system into territory Chiol-su could not read. The marsh gully snares had produced 5 catches in the past week, 3 hares, 1 large water rat, 1 bird taken by a modified drop trap rather than a loop snare, a flat stone triggered by a stick so thin that a pigeon's foot pressure was enough to spring it. He had not mentioned the rat or the bird to the sisters by species. He processed everything at the copse drying site and brought back dried material without category attached to it. Protein was protein. The system did not have room for preferences. He added 3 new snare positions, each requiring knowledge of approach routes that no one who hadn't mapped the terrain specifically would know to use. He began timing his movements to a 30-minute window he had identified in Chiol-su's walking pattern. The half-hour the accountant spent at the village's western end meant the eastern routes to the marsh were unobserved by the sharpest available set of eyes. He used those 30 minutes as the primary movement window every day without exception. He also addressed the smell problem more systematically. The drying rack in the copse was the main risk point. Dried meat had a lower odor profile than fresh or cooking meat, but in cold still air it carried further than expected. He built a secondary enclosure around the rack using tightly woven dead branches packed with mud at the gaps, a partial windbreak that also served as odor containment. Not airtight. Better than nothing. At the house, Hyunja began cooking exclusively when the wind came from the east. Mireille tracked wind direction each morning from the window gap and reported it before any cooking decision was made. This felt excessive only if you had not yet experienced the specific problem of a careful man who walked the street 3 times a day and used his nose the way a surveyor used a level. He buried the spent bones below the frost line at the marsh edge. Not in a pile, dispersed across a 10-foot stretch, 6 inches down, the surface smooth each time. No cluster, no smell concentration, no trail leading back. On the 4th day after Chiol-su's visit, Suwa came to find him at the copse. She moved through the hidden entrance correctly. She had been using it for 5 days and had stopped needing to be reminded of the entry angle. She appeared at the rack, waited until he looked up, then said, "A man came." Not Chiol-su. Someone with him. Different coat. Official buttons. He read this immediately. Someone Chiol-su had reported to. Which meant Chiol-su had reported something worth reporting upward, not a certainty, a possibility. A house that was dying more slowly than expected. A brother who had recovered from near death with slightly too much coherence behind the eyes. How long ago? 20 minutes. I ran the back way. He looked at the drying rack. 4 strips in various stages. He pulled the 2 most finished, dry enough to be odorless at short distance, and pressed them inside his coat against his body. The remaining 2 he covered with the branch ceiling and pressed fresh mud into the gaps where the enclosure had dried and cracked overnight. Did Hyunja see them arrive? She was at the table. she saw them on the road. Good. Hyunja's face was always ready. He returned via the frozen field approach, entering through the back fence gap, arriving looking like a man who had been walking empty ground for no particular reason. Cheol-soo was in the room. Beside him, a younger man in a dark coat with brass buttons, a district inspector, or someone equivalent, the specific title less important than the basic fact that he outranked Cheol-soo, which meant his assessment carried weight that Cheol-soo's did not. The younger man looked at him. Looked at the room. The pot on the stove. The open chest. The children. "This is the brother," Cheol-soo said. Something in his tone was different from 5 days prior. More careful. The tone of a man presenting rather than inspecting, as if he had brought a superior to confirm a suspicion and was now slightly uncertain the suspicion would hold. "Working capacity," the inspector said. "Recovering," Cheol-soo said. "Assigned to light work pending full assessment." "Food situation?" "Minimal." "Root material?" "Consistent with zone average." The inspector looked at him directly. "How did you recover from the fever?" "Casual delivery." Not a casual question. "Slowly," he said. He let the word cost something, a slight pause before it, a slight effort in the delivery, the impression of a man for whom sustained speech was still a marginal expenditure. "My sisters kept the stove alive. I slept most of it. When I could sit up, I started moving around. I'm still not strong." "And eating?" "What they had." He held the inspector's gaze at the level of a man with a clear conscience and an empty kitchen. "Which wasn't much." A long moment. The inspector's eyes moved across the room one final time, the practiced sweep of someone looking for the one thing that didn't sit right. The stove. The chest. The jug. The children's faces, blank and tired and giving nothing. Suah was looking at a point on the wall slightly above the inspector's head. Jiho had his eyes on the floor. The expression on his face was the expression of a child waiting for something unpleasant to finish real enough to be unperformable, which meant it was not performed. The inspector looked away. Made a final note in his pocketbook. He said something low to Cheol-soo. Cheol-soo responded. The inspector went out. Cheol-soo lingered. He looked at him with the same assessing quality as before, but now with an addition, the specific expression of a man who had brought a superior to confirm what he suspected and had found the confirmation not arriving cleanly. Not cleared. Not confirmed. Suspended. 5 days, Cheol-soo said. Full labor assessment. Be ready. He held him in his gaze for one final second. Then he followed the inspector out, and the door closed, and the room was quiet. In the silence, the only sound was Pavlo on the stove, breathing, still shallow, but present, still working at the basic task of continuing. He stood at the table and did not move for a moment. Cheol-soo had brought a superior to look at them. That meant the accountant's suspicion had reached a level he couldn't process alone. The inspector had looked and found nothing actionable. But found nothing was not the same as stopped looking. It was the same as insufficient evidence, pending further observation. Cheol-soo would come back in 5 days for the labor assessment. And Cheol-soo, he understood now with complete clarity, was not going to stop. He was a man who measured things, and something in this house was not measuring the way it should, and men who measured things for a living did not leave unmeasured discrepancies alone. They came back. They came back again. They came back until the discrepancy resolved itself into either a discovery or a death. He looked at the floorboard in the corner. The cache beneath it held 2 days of dried meat and the remaining hindquarters from the last hare. He was going to need a second cache. In a different location. Holding a different portion. Because the first principle of anything that needed to survive inspection was the same principle that made distributed snare placement work: no single point should contain enough to be decisive. What could be found at any one location should be findable and still leave the searcher with nothing conclusive. He crouched at the floor and began planning where the second cache would go. Outside, Cheol-soo's footsteps receded down the road. The first inspection had failed to find them. The second one would be more thorough. He had 5 days. The freeze came on a Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday in a place where the days had largely stopped having individual names. It came not gradually but as a fact, overnight, without transition, the temperature dropping through a threshold that changed the nature of everything outside the walls. The drainage channel at the field edge, which had been partly liquid as recently as yesterday afternoon, was solid to the bottom by morning. The marsh gully where he had been running snares for 2 weeks was locked under 4 inches of gray ice, the root tangles at the waterline encased in inaccessible, the soft mud where the animal tracks had been pressed into permanent record like something fossilized. He stood at the gully edge at first light and understood that this phase of the system was over. Not the whole system. A phase. The distinction mattered enormously because one of them was a crisis and the other was a variable, and he had spent 3 weeks building something designed to survive variables. He checked the remaining snares. 2 were sprung and frozen around nothing, the animals had been through before the hard freeze and triggered the mechanisms, and the cold had locked everything in place before he'd come to check. 1 snare was simply gone, the twine taken again, the stake still in the ground. The marsh reed snare was inaccessible under the ice. He pulled what he could recover, replaced nothing, and went back to the house through the long route. The village had changed in 48 hours in the specific way that extreme cold changed places already at their limit. 3 houses he passed showed no smoke. Not the careful, managed absence of smoke that he maintained by design, the genuine absence of smoke from houses where there was no longer anyone with enough energy to feed the stove. 2 of those houses had their doors slightly open. Cold air came out of them the same as it came out of everything else. At the house on the corner, a child was sitting in the doorway wrapped in what appeared to be a curtain, staring at nothing with the blank, turned inward expression of a body that has rerouted all its remaining resources to the core functions and has nothing left for the face. He did not stop. He could not stop, and looking was already too much information to carry when he needed his mind on the next problem. He kept walking. Inside his own house, the stove was still going. Barely, the ember small, the heat minimal, not enough to warm the far corner where the wall was frost-lined even on the inside. But going. He had built the reserve for this specifically, 3 days ago, when he'd read the cloud formation at the horizon and known what was coming. He'd spent a full afternoon pulling deadwood from the collapsed fence line at the field edge, breaking it into stove lengths, carrying it back in 3 separate trips through the back route, stacking it between the wall and the chest where it was not visible from the door. Hyunja had watched him do this without questioning it. She had learned not to question the preparation for things that had not happened yet. The wood was there now. The stove was alive. He sat at the table and ran the accounting. The food stores looked like this: in the floor cache under the far corner, 6 strips of dried hare, 2 of dried rat, 1 piece of larger dried meat from the bird, all wrapped in cloth. The strips were thin, hard, the texture of leather, properly dried, which meant they would hold for weeks without rotting and would dissolve into broth when boiled. In the second cache, behind the loose stone in the stove's base, a gap he'd found when cleaning ash and had quietly widened, another 4 strips and the rendered fat from the last 2 cooks, stored in the small ceramic jar with a cloth pressed over the top. The fat was cloudy white, semi-solid in the cold, exactly what he needed it to be. In the root store he'd built under the stove itself, in the natural heat pocket that the brick base created, 14 dried cattail root sections, 2 bundles of dried inner birch bark, and a cloth bag of dried water plant material that he'd been collecting from the marsh over 2 weeks, reduced to something that looked like hay but contained more nutrition than it appeared to. He had never shown anyone the complete picture. Each sister knew about the part of the system she managed. None of them knew the total. This was not distrust, it was the specific risk management of a situation where the weakest point in any information chain was the moment a person, under extreme stress, said more than they meant to. He was looking at approximately 12 days of minimal sustenance. If the freeze held for more than 2 weeks, they would be in trouble. If it held for 3, they would be in serious trouble. But they would be in trouble at 12 days, not at 2, which was where they would have been without the 3 weeks of quiet, careful accumulation. He called Hyunja over and showed her the accounting. Not all of it. The shape of it, the duration, the daily allocation, the priority order. We go to half rations, he said. Starting today. She looked at the numbers. The children, half of what they've been eating is still double what they were eating when I got here, he said. Their bodies adjusted upward. They'll adjust downward. They won't like it. They won't like it at all. But the alternative to half rations today is no rations in 8 days instead of 12. She was quiet for a moment. Pavlo, she said. He knew what she meant. The youngest boy had been improving steadily. Half rations meant slower improvement, or a plateau. Pavlo gets the same portion as the others, he said. He gets his evening water with the addition we've been giving him. That doesn't change. He looked at her directly. I know how that sounds. It sounds correct, she said. I just wanted to say his name. He understood that. The freeze brought a secondary problem he had anticipated and one he had not. The anticipated problem was movement. Chiolsu had not formally prohibited leaving the village, but the cold and the road conditions and the general tightening of the accountant's presence, he was walking his route 4 times a day now, not 3, created a practical restriction. Going to the copse, even by the long back route, meant crossing open ground that was now fully visible in all directions. The scrub vegetation that had provided marginal cover in autumn now reduced to skeletal sticks above white ground. Footprints in new snow were readable from 50 meters. He solved this by timing movement to snowfall windows. He watched the sky carefully, learning the specific cloud formations that preceded snow in this geography, the particular flat gray ceiling, the way the wind dropped before it started, and used the falling snow itself as cover. Footprints made during snowfall were partially filled in an hour and fully obscured in 3. He moved during snow, returned during snow, and the trail he left behind him softened and disappeared as he walked. The unanticipated problem was the neighbors. On the 5th day of the freeze, a woman appeared at their door in the late afternoon. He didn't know her name. She was perhaps 50, though she looked 70, wearing a man's coat tied shut with a rope, her feet wrapped in layers of cloth rather than boots. She stood in the doorway when Hyunja opened it and looked past her into the room with the specific, undisguised hunger of someone who was no longer in a social condition to disguise it. I smelled something, she said. Yesterday. From this direction. He was at the table when it happened. He heard the exchange and did not move. Hyunja's voice was level and kind in the way that level kindness was its own form of firmness. We cooked some root, she said. Cat tail. From the river. There's none left, we used everything we had. I'm sorry. The woman stood in the doorway for a long moment. The children, she said. Are they alive? Hyunja said. Barely. Another moment. The woman looked at the room, the stove, the children on it, the table. Her eyes moved across all of it with the expression of someone checking whether what they were seeing matched what they had expected to see. He held very still. Not unnaturally still, he was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface, which was a normal resting position. But he was reading her the way he read the gully terrain, what she was looking for, where her days went longest, what she had come with and what she would leave with. She left with nothing except Hyunja's quiet apology and a half-truth about cattail root. When the door closed, he let 3 minutes pass before speaking. She'll come back, he said. I know, Hyunja said. Or she'll tell someone. Both, he said. She'll tell someone first and then come back herself. He looked at the stove. The smell is the problem. We managed it well for 3 weeks. The freeze changed the air movement, cold air is denser, it carries smell lower and further than warm air does. What was manageable in autumn is less manageable now. He thought about this for a moment. We moved the cooking window to after dark, he said. When the street traffic is lowest. We reduced the fire to the minimum that still produces edible output. We used the root stores and fat rather than fresh cook the dried meat. The root smell is common enough that it doesn't signal the same thing. Un Seo, who had been listening from the corner, spoke. And when the root is gone? We'll be past the worst of the freeze by then. The marsh will have at least partial melt at the edges. The animal movement will resume. He said this with more certainty than the weather permitted, because certainty was a resource in this room and he was not going to deplete it unnecessarily. We're not past the hard part. We're in it. The stores we built are for being in it. On the 9th day of the freeze, the village held what passed for a meeting. Not an organized meeting, more an accumulation at the well, where people gathered because the well was the one point of common purpose. He went, because not going would itself have been noticed, and stood at the back of the loose cluster with the demeanor he had been practicing, present but minimal, expending nothing, showing nothing. He counted the faces. There were fewer than there had been 3 weeks ago. Not dramatically fewer, the village was dying in the way things died in cold water, slowly from the outside in, the edges going first. But fewer. Perhaps 6 households that had been present at the collective field work in autumn were now effectively absent, no one moving, no smoke, no response to the morning movement that passed for social contact. Shiol-su was there. Of course he was. He stood slightly apart from the cluster, ledger under his arm, watching the gathering with the expression he wore when processing data. His eyes moved across the assembled faces methodically. When they reached him, they paused. Not long. A fraction of a second longer than they paused at anyone else. Then moved on. He went back to the house through the woodshed route. The early decisions were paying out now. He could see it in the specific arithmetic of the stores. The dried meat that had seemed excessive when he'd been making it strip after strip, day after day, the cop's drying rack running continuously through the mild weeks, was now the reason they had 12 days instead of 2. The fat in the ceramic jar, rendered and stored when the cooking fire was still easy and fuel was less precious, was now the reason the root water broth had enough caloric density to matter. The second fire cache, the one behind the stove stone, was the reason Shiol-su's first inspection had found nothing decisive. The birch bark, which Unesio had dried and scraped mechanically every evening as he'd asked, now filled a cloth bundle that she'd been quietly adding to the starch base of every cook for a week. She had not measured it or tracked it consciously. She had simply done the task every evening because she had been asked to do it every evening, and the accumulation was there now when the accumulation was needed. Jiho knew 3 routes to the water that avoided the main street entirely, and he was using all 3 on rotation, never the same one twice in a row, the way he'd been taught. So I checked the closest snare position, now relocated to just inside the cop's edge, a spot that remained accessible even in partial freeze, every second morning on her way back from the well run, reading the mechanism without touching it, reporting back with the precision of someone who had been doing it long enough to know what normal looked like. The family was a system. Not a perfect system. Not a complete system. But a system with redundancy built into it, with multiple functions distributed across multiple people, with no single point whose failure would collapse everything else. On the 11th day of the freeze, it began to snow again, and he used the snowfall window to check the cops. The drying rack was still there. The enclosure was intact. Inside, 2 strips from the last catch before the freeze, almost fully cured now, the surface dry and hard to the touch. He checked the nearest snare. Empty. Untriggered. But the ground around it showed something. At the edge of the snow cover, where the copse undergrowth created a slight thermal shelter that kept the ground from freezing as hard as open terrain, a set of fresh tracks. Narrow, 4-toed, the stride length he knew. Something was moving again. The freeze was breaking at the margins, the way freezes did, from the sheltered places outward. The animals had retreated to the protected ground, the low spots and covered areas where the frost was thinner, and those were exactly the places where he had relocated his snares 3 weeks ago. He crouched over the track and held his hand above it, feeling the residual warmth of an animal that had passed through recently enough to leave unfrozen impression in the mud beneath the snow's surface. 2 hours old. Maybe less. He adjusted the snare trigger by a fraction, lowering the sensitivity slightly to account for the lighter animal pressure on frozen ground versus soft, and covered his own approach tracks with a branch drag as he left. He came back through the snowfall. Behind him, the tracks filled in slowly, and then were gone. Inside the house, the stove burned at its minimum viable level, the children were on the stove wrapped in everything available, and the pot held a thin root broth with fat dissolved into it that would, on careful analysis, contain enough to keep 8 people's organs functioning for another day. Not comfortable. Functional. The freeze was still holding. But for the first time in 11 days, the tracks said that the world outside was beginning, very slowly, at the edges, to thaw. The thaw came in stages, the way all real things came, not as an event but as a series of small measurable changes that accumulated into a new condition. First the south-facing slope of the gully bank. Then the reed margin at the river's far bend. Then the drainage channel at the field edge, which cracked along its center line one morning and began running again by afternoon, the water dark and cold and moving. He watched all of this the way he watched everything now, as information about what was possible next. On the 14th day after the freeze began, he checked the marsh gully snares and found 2 of the 3 sprung. One empty, triggered by something that had pulled free. One holding a hare, smaller than any he'd taken before, its ribs visible under the fur, but intact. He processed it at the cop's site, restored the strips to the drying rack, and walked back through the field approach. The village had survived the freeze in the way that things at the margin survived hard conditions, by losing its edges. The count at the well, which he'd been running every day as a mental register, was down by at least a dozen people from the number he'd estimated before the cold came. Not all dead. Some had left, or tried to leave. He'd seen 2 families with bundled children heading toward the main road during the snowfall, walking with the specific, committed slowness of people who had decided that dying in motion was preferable to dying in place. Whether they had made it anywhere was information he didn't have. The house at the corner, where the child had been sitting in the doorway in the curtain, was closed and silent. He did not let himself look at it for long. But some houses were still going. He had identified 2 of them in the first week, before the freeze, and had been watching them since. Not because they were important to him in any sentimental sense, because they were the most viable adjacent nodes, and a single isolated node, however well designed, existed in a context, and if the context collapsed entirely, the node collapsed with it. This was the thing he had understood in the abstract since the first week and had been postponing acting on because action required exposure, and exposure was the thing he had spent 3 weeks minimizing. But the freeze had clarified the timeline. The village was losing mass too quickly. If it continued losing mass at the current rate, the social structure that made the village a village, the informal mutual awareness that kept individual households from being picked off one by one, would dissolve before spring. And without that structure, a family with food became a target rather than a household. He needed at least 2 other households functioning. Not dependent on him. Functioning independently, using their own resources, by their own means. He needed to give them the method, not the meat. The first house was the Lim family, 2 doors south. He had identified them in the first week because of their children. There were 4 of them, 2 boys and 2 girls, ranging from perhaps 4 to 12, and unlike the children in most houses, they were still moving. Not well. Not strongly. But moving, which meant someone in that house was still making decisions that kept them moving. The someone was the eldest boy, who was perhaps 17, whom he had seen twice making the same pre-dawn movement he made, out the door early, back route, heading toward the river. The boy had not found much. He could tell by the way the boy moved on the return, the unchanged heaviness of someone who has been out and come back empty, but he was looking, and looking in the right direction, and that was the starting point. He found the boy at the river on the 3rd day after the thaw began. Not by accident. He had timed it deliberately, positioning himself at the reed margin at the time the boy's pattern suggested he would appear. The boy's name was Lim Jae-won. He was tall for someone at his level of depletion, angular, with the specific wariness of a person who had learned that other people in the current environment represented resource competition rather than social interaction. He stopped when he saw him and assessed the situation with an older person's eyes in a young face. "You're from 2 doors up," the boy said. "Yes. You come here every morning." So the boy had been watching too. "Good. I do," he said. "I've been doing better than most at the river because I know where to look. I want to show you 2 things. You can use them or not. I'm not asking for anything back." The boy held his position for a moment. Assessing. Then he took 2 steps closer, which was the answer. He showed him the snail beds first. Where the root tangles were, how to identify the specific texture of dormant shells in cold water, how to move along the bank without disturbing the substrate so you could work the same stretch multiple mornings. He showed him the cattail rhizomes and how to identify the ones that still had density versus the ones that had been freeze damaged and would fall apart on boiling. He showed him how to read the water's surface for the insect activity that indicated organic richness in the sediment below. The boy watched and listened in the way someone listened when they had decided the information was real, not politely, not deferentially, but with the focused attention of a person integrating something directly into their operational thinking. "The snails," the boy said. "I thought they were too small to matter." "Per shell, yes," he said. 80 shells is not too small to matter." The boy looked at the root tangle. At the number of root tangles along the bank. The arithmetic happened behind his eyes. "I'll show you one more thing," he said. He took the boy to the gully, not by the direct route, by the arc he used. He showed him how to read the animal track record at the meltwater edge and how to set a basic loop snare on a confirmed run. He showed him the trigger mechanism, how to test it, how to anchor it without leaving a hand smell signature on the trigger twig by using a stick rather than bare fingers. "Don't tell anyone you have snares here," he said. "Not which spot, not that you're setting them at all. The first time someone else knows where your snare is, it becomes their snare." The boy absorbed this without needing it explained further. He was 17 years old and had been surviving a famine for months. He understood the social dynamics of scarcity without requiring a lecture on them. "Why are you telling me this?" the boy asked. He considered giving a partial answer. He gave the true one instead. "Because if every house around me empties out, the one that's still standing becomes visible," he said. "I don't survive alone. I survive in a village. A village needs at least some houses still working. I need you working." The boy looked at him for a long moment. "That's honest," he said. "It's practical," he said. "They're usually the same thing." The second house was harder. The family there was older, a grandmother, her daughter, and 3 grandchildren, the eldest perhaps 10. No adult male, no adolescent with the physical capacity for extended foraging. What they had was the grandmother herself, who he had watched from the window gap for 2 weeks and who had the specific, adaptive intelligence of someone who had lived through enough hard seasons to know that survival was a matter of system, not luck, but who was running a system adapted to conditions 30 years ago, without the current information set. Her name, he learned from Mireille, was Baek Jeom-soon. She had been a midwife before the collective years. She had specific skills and specific knowledge about plants and roots and which things could be boiled and which couldn't. She was, in the current situation, a more valuable resource than she appeared. He approached her directly, because she was not a frightened boy who needed careful positioning. She was a woman who had delivered half the village's children and had no patience for indirect communication. He knocked on her door in the mid-morning when Cheol-su's route was confirmed to be at the western end. She opened the door and looked at him with the expression of someone who had been opening doors for strangers for 40 years and could read the nature of the visit before the visitor spoke. "You're the one who came back from the fever," she said. "Yes. And you've been eating," she said. "Not accusation. Assessment." "Carefully," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then stepped back from the door. Inside her house, the 3 grandchildren were on the stove. The daughter was at the table, sorting through a small pile of dried plant material with the painstaking focus of someone for whom each piece was significant. The room smelled of dried herbs and something faintly animal, not meat, but the residue of bone water, which meant she had been boiling bones already. He looked at the bone water smell and revised his estimate of Baek Jeom-soon upward. "What do you know about the marsh gully?" he asked. "I know it exists," she said. "What's living there right now?" She sat, which he took as an invitation to sit as well. Over the next hour he told her what he had mapped and what he had found. He told her specifically about the waterfowl patterns at the reed margin, the specific hour of early morning when birds moved through the still frozen shallows and which position provided the best approach angle. He told her about the drop trap mechanism, which was simpler to build than a loop snare and more appropriate for the physical capacity available in her household. It required a flat stone, a trigger stick, and a scatter of dry grain dust as bait, which she had in the form of the floor sweepings from the collective storehouse that she had saved, he noticed, in a cloth bag hanging from the wall nail. She listened the way old people with real knowledge listened, not passively, but in dialogue, inserting what she knew, correcting small errors in his botanical identifications, adding information about root depth in this specific soil type that he didn't have. The cattail base where the ground is sandier holds longer into freeze than the clay bank sections, she said. The sand drains and insulates differently. You can dig 2 weeks longer than you'd expect. He had not known this. He filed it immediately. The inner bark from elm works better than birch for sustained energy, she added. Less pleasant, but more density. There are 3 elm trees at the cemetery's south edge. He had walked past those trees a dozen times. He had assessed them as birch adjacent and moved on. He had been wrong. "You know a great deal," he said. "I delivered babies for 20 years in places that didn't always have enough to eat," she said. "You learn what keeps people going and what doesn't." She looked at him with clear, direct eyes. What do you want from me? I want you running a version of what I'm running, he said. Not the same, your household has different capacity. Adapted. I want to know you're still here in 2 months, and I want to know what you know, because you know things I don't. She was quiet for a moment. The thing you're doing, she said slowly. The careful thing. The man who walks with the book, does he know? He suspects something, he said. He hasn't found anything. She looked at the wall where the floor sweeping's bag hung. He came here 2 weeks ago, she said. He looked at my grandchildren. He wrote something in the book. A pause. He didn't take the bag. Because it looks like nothing. Because it looks like nothing, she agreed. There was a long silence. Then she leaned forward. The elm trees, she said. I'll show you the correct strip width. You've been taking too much at a time from the birch, I've seen your cuts. You'll kill those trees before spring. He felt the specific, cold recognition of a mistake he had not known he was making. Show me tomorrow, he said. She nodded. He walked back to his own house through the woodshed route, taking the long way, thinking about the shape of what was forming. 2 additional households now not dependent, not fed by him, but informed. Running adapted versions of the same basic logic, find what others aren't finding, process it quietly, store it distributed, show nothing on the outside. From Cheol-su's perspective, the village was continuing to decline. 3 households happening to survive the freeze at slightly better rates than others was not a pattern. It was noise. Random variation. The kind of thing that happened when some families had slightly more biological resilience than others, or had started the winter with slightly more body mass, or had slightly better luck. As long as the 3 households did not visibly coordinate, there was no pattern to find. But he was aware of what he was doing, fully aware, and what he was doing had a name that Cheol-su would recognize immediately if he could see its shape clearly. He was building a network. Small, informal, invisible, operating entirely below the level at which official structures looked. 3 households sharing method rather than resources, each functioning independently, each invisible from the outside. The network was not large enough to threaten anything yet. But it was large enough to begin being threatening in principle. Because the thing that the system that Cheol-su represented could not tolerate was not hungry people were expected, managed, accounted for. What it could not tolerate was hungry people who found a way to be less hungry without permission, outside the distribution channels, outside the ledger, outside the accounting. People who survived without being entered in the book were people who existed outside the book. And Cheol-su was a man whose function was to make sure that everything that existed was in the book. He came through the back fence gap into his own yard and stood for a moment looking at the house. Inside, 8 people who were alive 14 days into a freeze that had ended at least a dozen other households in the same village, who had survived it on stores that had been built from nothing by 3 weeks of patient, specific, invisible work. Outside, a man with a ledger who was going to come back in 5 days with sharper eyes than last time. And now, 2 doors south and 4 doors north, 2 additional households that were no longer waiting for the end as passively as they had been. He went inside. The stove was still burning. The second link of the next chain had been placed. Cheol-su came back on the 5th day, as promised, but he did not come alone and he did not come in the morning. He came at midday, the specific hour when the household was most likely to be in the middle of something, when the cook was either in progress or recently finished, when the smell was at its highest and the evidence was warmest. He came with 2 men, the district inspector from the previous visit, and a second figure he had not seen before, a younger man in a militia coat who carried nothing official but whose presence communicated a function that did not require official markers. 3 people at the door was a different kind of visit than 1 person at the door. 1 person conducted an inspection. 3 people conducted a search. Mireille had seen them coming from the window gap. She had been at her position since morning, as she was every morning now, because her role in the system was observation and she took it with the specific seriousness of someone who understood that the value of advance warning was measured in the minutes it provided. She had come to find him at the table when they were still 40 meters down the road. He had used those minutes. The pot on the stove, the morning's root broth, genuinely thin, genuinely poor, exactly what it appeared to be. He had planned the morning cook specifically around the possibility of this visit, no dried meat in the broth, no fat dissolved into it, the smell of pure cattail root and water, which was the smell of minimal subsistence. The floor cache, he had moved its contents 3 days ago when he'd assessed the visit was coming. The dried strips were now in 3 separate locations outside the house, 2 wrapped in cloth inside a hollow in the woodshed wall that Unesio had lined with dry moss, 1 in a clay jar buried at the base of the back fence post under 6 inches of soil, a location he'd prepared in the first week and never used until now. The floor cache itself was not empty, that would be its own kind of information. It held a single strip of partially dried root material, the birch bark bundle, and an old cloth. Enough to show the cache existed and had been found, not enough to show the cache had been used for what it had actually been used for. The stove base cache behind the loose stone, untouched. He had calculated that 2 caches found was more convincing than 1 cache found. Finding both would make the inspection feel complete. The stove cache held 4 strips, real dried meat, real evidence wrapped in the cloth he had placed there deliberately, in a configuration that looked like someone's best attempt at concealment rather than someone's decoy. He had put the Real Reserve in the stove cache because the stove cache was the one Chiolsu was less likely to know about. And because the stove cache was findable by a determined search, which meant finding it would feel like a victory rather than a setup. He sat at the table when they came in. He did not stand. He let the sitting position communicate what he wanted it to communicate, a man who had been resting because he was still not fully at working strength, not a man who had been moving things. Chiolsu took the room in a single sweep and immediately went to the stove. Lifted the lid. Looked at the broth. The smell reached all 3 of them: cattail, water, the mineral undertone of the clay pot. Nothing else. He put the lid down. The militiaman went to the chest. Opened it, went through the contents methodically, pressed the cloth bundles between his fingers, turned the empty jar over, set it down. The inspector stood near the door and watched, which was his function. Assessment rather than action. The floor, Chiolsu said. The militiaman began at the door and worked toward the far wall, pressing the boards with his boot heel, listening for the hollow difference between a board over solid soil and a board over a cavity. He was good at it. He reached the far corner in under 3 minutes and found the cache on the second press. He pried the board up with the small tool he'd brought, a short iron bar, which confirmed that this was not an improvised search but a prepared one. He looked at the contents. Pulled out the root strip, the birch bundle, the cloth. Set them on the floor and looked at them. Chiolsu crouched beside the open cache. He looked at it for a long time. "This is everything?" he said. "That's everything," he said from the table. He said it with the flat, tired quality of a man confirming something humiliating rather than something threatening. "I've been putting aside what I find. It's not much." "Root material," Chiolsu said. "Root material," he confirmed. Chiolsu looked at the birch strips. He picked one up, bent it, smelled it. Set it down. The militiaman continued across the room. He reached the stove and began pressing along its base, and on the 4th press, the loose stone moved. He pulled the stone free and reached inside. The 4 strips of dried meat came out wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped them and held them up. The room went very quiet. Chiolsu stood. He walked to the stove and looked at the strips in the militiaman's hand. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at him. "Where did this come from?" he said. "The marsh," he said. "I found a dead animal. 2 weeks ago. Before the hard freeze. I dried what I could." "Found," Chiolsu said. "Found," he confirmed. "I didn't say it was much. I said I found dead animals in the marsh sometimes. Animals die in the cold. You find them, you use them. A found animal was not hunted game. A found animal was not a violation of any specific prohibition. It was simply a man with sharp eyes and low standards who had taken something already dead." Chiolsu's expression was the expression of a man who was not certain this was true and was also not certain it was false, and who understood that certainty was what the ledger required before the ledger's consequence could be activated. "You've been caching food," Chiolsu said. "I've been saving what I find so there's something for the children tomorrow as well as today," he said. "That's all I've been doing." Chiolsu looked at the strips. Looked at him. Looked at the children on the stove, who were watching with the faces they had practiced, blank, tired, giving nothing. He looked at Pavlo, who was awake today, sitting up, his eyes more focused than they had been a week ago. Chiolsu looked at the improvement in the boy's condition for 2 full seconds. He wrote something in the ledger. The food is subject to collective assessment, he said. What you find in the zone is community property under the current allocation framework. I understand, he said. Take what you need to take. This was the sentence he had been holding since Mireille had given him the advance warning. It was the most important sentence in the entire exchange, and he delivered it without hesitation, without resentment, and without moving from the table. Because if he said take what you need to take, the calculus became, what does Chiolsu take? And what Chiolsu could take was 4 strips of dried meat from the stove cache. What Chiolsu could not take was the woodshed wall hollow or the fence post burial or the 2 days of birch bark or the ongoing snare system or Beck Jiamsun's elm knowledge or Lim Jaewon's river routes or any of the 10 other things that constituted the actual system. What Chiolsu could take was the decoy. Chiolsu looked at him for a long moment. Then he took 2 of the 4 strips. Left 2. Wrote something in the ledger. Collective contribution, he said. Recorded and credited. He put the strips in his coat pocket with the practiced ease of a man doing administrative work. Then he looked around the room one final time. At the pot. The chest. The floor cache with its birch bark and root material. At the children. At the 2 strips of dried meat still sitting on the stovetop where the militiaman had left them. He closed the ledger. Labor assessment, he said. Tomorrow. East Road, morning. Don't be late. He left. The inspector followed. The militiaman replaced the stovestone, put the floorboard back, and went out last, pulling the door closed behind him. The room held silence for a full minute. Then Sua, from the stove, said quietly, he didn't find the woodshed. No, he said. He didn't find the fence post. No. She was quiet for a moment. He took the ones you left for him, she said. Not a question. He looked at her, this 8-year-old girl who had been tracking snare lines and learning water routes and practicing her face for 3 weeks. Yes, he said. She absorbed this. Then, will he come back? Yes. But not right away. He found something. When someone finds something, they feel like they've found the thing. It takes time before they start wondering if they found everything. He stood from the table and went to the stove. Picked up the 2 remaining strips and put them in his coat pocket. He would move them to the woodshed cache before dark. He looked at Hyunja. She said nothing. She had nothing to say. She had watched the inspection happen and had watched the inspection resolve into the outcome he had designed for it, and what she was processing was not the outcome but the fact that the outcome had been designed. Not luck. Not fortune. Design. The labor assessment tomorrow, she said finally. I'll go, he said. Road work. It's supervised, which means Chiolsu will see me there and put me in the working column of the ledger. A man in the working column of the ledger is a man who is accounted for. Accounted for men are less interesting than unaccounted ones. You'll lose a full day, she said. You won't be able to check the snares. J1 will check the gully snares, he said. I spoke to him yesterday. He knows which ones are mine and which are his. He checks mine, I check his. We don't speak about it to anyone else. She looked at him. You set that up before the inspection, she said. 3 days ago, he confirmed. Another silence, different from the one after Chiolsu left. Longer. The silence of someone revising their understanding of something. The day you moved the floor cache, she said. You knew he was coming. I assessed it was likely, he said. 5 days was what he said. He came on the 5th day. Chiolsu is a man who means what he schedules. And the strips in the stove cache, she said slowly. You put them there for him to find. I put them where a determined search would find them, he said. Which is not the same as hiding them there. She was quiet for a long time. If he had taken all 4, she said. Then we would have lost 4 strips and kept everything else, he said. Which is still everything else. He went to the labor assessment at dawn the next morning. The road clearing detail was 8 men, working under the supervision of a collective brigadier who reported to the district level, which reported to something above that. The work was clearing frozen mud and debris from the main road, functionally useless work, the road serving almost no traffic, the clearing serving almost no purpose except the purpose of having a recorded population of working men who could be pointed to as evidence of functional collective organization. He worked at the pace of someone at 70% capacity. Not the pace of a healthy man, that would have been its own kind of information. The pace of someone recovering. The pace that matched his established narrative. Cheol-soo came at midday to walk the line and check the roster. He passed him without stopping. Marked something in the ledger. Moved on. In the afternoon, during the break period, he sat at the road edge and looked at the village from the outside, from a vantage point he hadn't had before. From here he could see 4 distinct smoke signatures: his own house, Baek Jiam-sun's house, Lim Jae-won's house, and the house on the far end that belonged to a family he hadn't spoken to yet but whose smoke pattern, thin, carefully managed, never excessive, had been telling him for a week that someone there was also thinking rather than simply burning. 4 houses. Cheol-soo had walked the road and made his notes. He had counted the smoke, too. He did not yet know that the smoke meant the same thing in 4 separate places. He would begin to know when it stayed that way through spring while everything else continued to fall. That moment was coming. He picked up his tool and went back to work. The road work lasted 6 days. He went each morning and came back each evening and worked at the pace he had set on the first day, consistent, unspectacular, the pace of a man at the edge of his capacity giving what he had without reserve. The brigadier recorded his attendance. Cheol-soo walked the line twice a day and made his marks. By the 4th day, he had become unremarkable, which was exactly the condition he was working toward. Unremarkable men were men the ledger had filed and moved past. He used the road work hours to observe. From the work line he could see portions of the village's periphery that his usual routes did not pass through. He could see which fields had been stripped completely and which still had root residue that someone with specific knowledge and a good knife could work. He could see the drainage patterns as the thaw progressed, which low points were collecting meltwater, which channels were running again, which areas of the surrounding terrain were softening first. He was building the next map while appearing to clear frozen debris from a road that served almost no one. On the 5th day he saw something that stayed with him through the evening and into the night. A cart came from the district road, pulling into the village from the east. Not a supply cart, nothing that came to this village anymore could be called a supply cart in any meaningful sense. This was an official cart, with 2 men in it he didn't recognize, and behind it a smaller vehicle with what appeared to be surveying equipment, measuring rods, a chain, a folded tripod. They went directly to Cheol-soo's house. They were there for 2 hours. Then they left. He said nothing about it that evening. He thought about it carefully for a full day before he said anything to anyone. What he concluded was this: surveyors did not come to dying villages to assess the dying. They came to assess what would remain after the dying was complete. Land boundaries, field divisions, asset registers, the administrative preparation for a redistribution of territory that assumed the current occupants would not be the future occupants. Someone above Cheol-soo's level had decided that this village was in its final functional phase and had sent people to prepare the paperwork for what came after. That paperwork required a timeline. Which meant someone had made a projection about when the current population would reach a level at which administrative reassignment became practical. He had perhaps 1 season, spring into early summer, before that projection became active policy. 1 season was enough if he used it correctly. It was not enough if he used it the way the past 6 weeks had been used, house by house, strip by strip, careful and minimal and invisible. That pace had kept 8 people alive through a freeze. It would not build something that could survive a systematic administrative action directed at the whole village simultaneously. He needed to think at a different scale. He told Hyunja first, the morning after the road work ended. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How certain are you?" she said. "Not certain," he said. "Probable. The surveying equipment is specific. It has specific uses. And if you're right? Then we have a season to build something that can't be administratively removed," he said. Which means it can't be in one place, and it can't be associated with one family, and it can't be something that shows up in a ledger. She was quiet again. You're talking about something larger than us, she said. I'm talking about the network we've already started, he said. Made deeper. Made more capable. Not visible from the outside, but functional enough that when the administrative action comes, there's something underneath it that continues. He spent the first week after the road work on terrain. Not the familiar terrain, the gully, the marsh, the copse. He had worked that area to its sustainable limit. He needed new ground. He went further than he had gone before, using the early mornings and the snowfall windows that still appeared every few days as the thaw progressed unevenly. He mapped 2 kilometers of terrain north of the village that he had not previously surveyed, a long belt of mixed scrub and old orchard land, the trees untended for years but still carrying the specific structural features of managed land that had returned partially to wildness. In old orchard land, the animal movement patterns were different from pure wilderness, the fruit residue from previous seasons, even rotted and frozen, attracted specific species to specific locations with the regularity of a managed feeding site. He found 3 active runs in the first 2 days, each showing the kind of consistent traffic that meant multiple animals using the same routes. He found a den site, a deep earthen burrow in the embankment at the orchard's northern edge, with the fresh territorial marking of an animal that had moved in recently, probably driven toward the shelter by the freeze. He found a stream tributary he had not known about, running shallow over stones, partially clear even in the cold, with the insect and crustacean density of water that hadn't been worked yet. He also found the location for the storage pit. He had been thinking about it since the freeze, a single central cache that multiple households could access, built below ground, insulated naturally by soil temperature, positioned far enough from the village to be outside the search radius Chiolsu applied to the household level but close enough to be practically accessible. The orchard embankment provided the ideal substrate, dense soil that would hold a dug cavity without collapse, natural root structure that created internal bracing, the overhang of the embankment itself providing weather cover. He dug the initial cavity over 3 morning sessions, working alone, removing the soil in cloth bags and distributing it at 3 different locations so there was no soil pile at the site. He lined the floor with flat stones from the stream bed, carried one at a time, the carrying spread across enough sessions that no single trip was heavy enough to leave deep boot impressions in the softening ground. The pit could hold, when finished, the equivalent of 2 weeks of the full network's food stores. Not all in one category, distributed by type, each section accessible without disturbing the others. He told Lim Jae-won about the pit on the 8th day. The boy came to look at it, crouching at the entrance with the assessing eyes that had become more specific over the past 3 weeks. How many people know? Jae-won asked. You, now. My sister Hyunja. No one else yet. When will you tell the old woman? When it's ready, he said. When I have something to show rather than something to describe. Jae-won nodded. He ran his hand along the stone floor. The stream, he said. I found the tributary 2 days ago. I didn't know you'd found it too. The crayfish at the lower bend, he said. Jae-won looked at him. You went in the water? The water is cold but not frozen at the bend. They're under the flat stones at the bottom. You don't need to go in, you need a forked stick and patience. Jae-won was quiet for a moment. I have patience, he said. Baek Ji-um came to see the pit on the 12th day. He had expected her to have questions about the construction. She looked at it for a long moment without speaking, then crouched and examined the stone floor and the root bracing and the soil composition of the walls with her hands, the way someone who had spent a lifetime working with the physical properties of natural materials examines something new. The walls will need clay packing in the upper section, she said. Where the roots thin out. The soil there is too sandy and will dry and crumble over summer. You'll lose the ceiling. She was right. He had seen the sandy band and had not yet solved it. I have clay from the riverbank, she said. I've been collecting it for pot repair. There's more than I need. I'll bring it. She looked at the entrance. The approach needs to change, she said. You've been coming from the north, which puts your line of travel visible from the high ground at the field edge when the sun is low in the morning. Come from the east, through the dry ditch. The ditch is below sightline from the field. He looked at the field edge. At the ditch. She was correct. You've been watching the approach angles, he said. I've been watching everything, she said. I'm old and I don't move fast. Watching is what I have. He considered something and then said it. The fourth house, he said. The family at the far end. Their smoke pattern suggests someone there is managing carefully. Do you know them? She was quiet for a moment. The widow Choi, she said. And her son. He's perhaps 14. She was a teacher before the collective years. A pause. She's intelligent. She's been surviving on intelligence because she has nothing else. But she doesn't know the terrain, she's from the city originally, she doesn't read outdoor signs. Would she listen? Baek Ji-soon considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. She would listen if it came through me, she said. She doesn't know you. She knows me. He thought about the surveying cart. About the timeline it represented. Bring her when you think it's right, he said. Don't rush it. Rushed trust breaks. The old woman nodded once, with the authority of someone who had been building trust in difficult conditions for 40 years and needed no instruction on the subject. He sat at the pit entrance in the late afternoon, after she left, and ran the accounting at the new scale. 4 households. Combined, perhaps 15 people still functional enough to contribute. 3 terrain zones now actively mapped: the Marsh Gully, the Northern Orchard Belt, the stream tributary. 1 storage pit under construction. 1 information network operating through 3 nodes that didn't visibly connect. Cheol-soo had taken 4 strips of dried meat and written collective contribution in his ledger. Below the ledger, invisible to it, something was growing that the ledger had no column for. Not an organization. Not yet. Not anything with a name or a structure that could be pointed to. Just 4 households sharing method, sharing terrain knowledge, sharing the specific understanding that surviving the next season required thinking at the scale of the next season rather than the next day. He looked at the sky through the orchard branches. The thaw was continuing. Slowly, unevenly, the way things returned in this climate, not a clean turn from one state to another but a long negotiation between what had been frozen and what the season was pulling back toward life. He could feel something similar happening in the village. Not hope, hope was too clean a word for what he felt. More like the specific sensation of a process that had been running correctly clicking into the next phase of its operation. The machine turning over. The surveying cart had come and gone. Somewhere in a district office, someone was writing projections onto paper. He had a season. He intended to use all of it. He covered the pit entrance with the branch lattice he'd built for it, checked that it disappeared into the embankment face at normal viewing distance, and went back to the village through the dry ditch, below the sightline from the field edge, the way the old woman had shown him. She was right about the approach angle. She was right about most things. That was the point of the network. No one person knew everything. Together, they were beginning to know enough. Spring came the way it always came in this latitude, not as a relief but as a new set of problems wearing relief's clothing. The snow retreated from the field edges first, leaving exposed soil that was black and wet and smelled of everything that had been under it since autumn. The drainage channels ran full and brown. The road through the village became impassable for 2 weeks as the frost left the ground unevenly, leaving the surface soft and the subsurface still rigid, so that every step broke through a crust into cold mud that grabbed at boots and released them reluctantly. During those 2 weeks, movement was harder for everyone. Including Cheol-soo. He used those 2 weeks at full capacity. The storage pit was completed on the 4th day of the thaw, the clay packing done with Baek Ji-soon's material, applied in layers and left to dry between sessions. The entrance was fitted with a flat stone cover that sat flush with the embankment face, invisible unless you knew the specific pressure point that released it. He showed the location to 4 people: Hyunja, Jae-won, Baek Ji-soon, and the widow Choi, a thin, straight-backed woman in her late 30s who had come with the old woman 3 days after Ji-soon had suggested bringing her, and who had listened to everything he said with the specific, evaluating attention of a person who had spent years teaching others to think and had not stopped thinking herself. Her name was Choi Seon-hwa. Her son was 14, named Choi Min-jun, and he was already running the snare line at the orchard's southern end after 2 days of instruction, with the focused application of a boy who understood precisely what failure meant. The network was 4 households. 15 functional people. One storage pit with 2 weeks of reserve, built from the accumulated surplus of the past month. The surplus existed because the system had been producing more than the minimum for 3 weeks. Not dramatically more, marginally more, consistently more, the kind of marginal consistent surplus that, accumulated across enough time, became a reserve that changed the nature of what was possible. He did the accounting on a flat stone at the pit entrance and then smoothed the surface and replaced the cover. They had survived the first arc. He knew they had survived it not from the stores or the snares or the network. He knew it from Pavlo. The youngest boy had been the measure from the beginning, the one who could not stand, whose breathing was the sound that had defined the first morning's silence. On the 38th day, Pavlo came off the stove under his own initiative. Not fully upright, he moved in the half-crotch of a body that had been horizontal for too long and was relearning the mechanics of vertical. He walked to the table. He sat at it. He looked out the window. No one said anything. Hyunja was at the stove and she kept her back turned for a moment longer than necessary. When she turned around, her face was the face she had been practicing, controlled, giving nothing. Her hands were not entirely controlled. She noticed, and she put them flat on the table surface until they were. Pavlo did not know any of this was happening behind him. He was looking out the window at the wet spring street with the complete, uncomplicated attention of someone who had not seen the outside world in a long time and found it interesting. "There's a bird," he said. His voice was small but clear. It was the first observation he had made about the world outside the stove in 38 days. "Yes," he said, from across the room. "There are more coming back now. You'll see more of them." Pavlo looked at the bird for a while. Then he looked back at the room. At him. "You go out every morning," Pavlo said. "Yes." "What do you find?" He looked at the boy. Pale, thin, the specific fragility of someone who had come back from a long distance and was still calibrating the return. But his eyes were sharp. They had always been sharp, even on the worst days. "Many things," he said. "I'll show you some of them when you're stronger." Pavlo absorbed this with the seriousness he applied to everything. "I want to learn," he said. He looked at the boy for a moment longer than he intended to. "You will," he said. The problem arrived, as he had known it would, not as a single event but as a pattern that became undeniable. It started with the woman who had come to their door during the freeze. She came back, and this time she brought her sister, and this time she did not ask about cattail root. She said she had watched the children in this house and she had watched the children in 2 other houses and she had noticed that those children were different from the children in the houses that were emptying. She said it without accusation. She said it with the raw directness of someone who has been stripped of every social convention by hunger and is left with only the essential statement. "Your children are alive. Mine are not. What do you know that I don't know?" He talked with her for a long time on the doorstep. He told her some things and not others, the snail beds, the cattail roots, the correct way to read root density in frozen ground. He did not tell her about the storage pit or the network or the organized snare rotation. Not because he didn't trust her but because trust was not the relevant variable. The relevant variable was what she would say to whom in the next 24 hours when she was hungry and frightened and something she'd heard seemed like it might help someone she loved. Information given to a desperate person spread at the speed of desperation. He gave her information that would help her and that, if it spread, would help others and would not map back to him as a source of systematic advantage. She left with the birch bark technique and the snail bed location and instructions on the cattail rhizome density test. She came back the next day with her sister and 2 other women from the road that had been losing houses steadily since the freeze. He taught them all the same things. Sheol soon noticed on the 3rd day. He came to the door in the late afternoon, not on his regular schedule, not with the district inspector, alone, and he stood at the entrance without coming inside and looked at him with the expression that had been developing over the past month. The expression had started as the faint registration of a discrepancy and had become something more specific, the expression of a man who had been watching a pattern coalesce and had finally allowed himself to name it. "There are women going to the river in the morning," Shiolsu said. "From 4 houses. They're going to the same location. People tell each other where the food is," he said. "That's what people do. They're going where you showed them to go." I showed no one anything official, he said. I talked to a woman at my door. People talk. Cheol-su looked at him. You've been talking to a number of people, he said. Hungry people come to doors, he said. I don't turn them away. A long pause. You're building something, Cheol-su said. Not an accusation in the legal sense. A recognition. The statement of a man who had been reading the terrain of the village the way he read animal terrain, and had found a pattern that didn't belong to chaos. He looked back at Cheol-su steadily. I'm helping people not die, he said. In the territory where that's possible. That's not your function, Cheol-su said. I wasn't given a function, he said. I was given a family to keep alive. I kept them alive. Others noticed. I can't control what people notice. Cheol-su held him in his gaze for a long moment. There was something in the accountant's expression that was not quite what he'd expected, not anger, not threat yet. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who had spent a long time doing a specific job in a specific way and had encountered something that his job's categories did not cleanly contain. He closed the ledger he had not opened. The district is conducting a full zone assessment next month, he said. All households. All resources. All working-age individuals. He said this as information rather than warning, but the distinction was thin. Be ready for it. He left. The door closed. He stood in the room for a while. The district assessment. A full zone survey, not a household inspection, the administrative action that preceded the redistribution he had read in the surveying cart's visit. Not Cheol-su acting alone. The level above Cheol-su, acting at scale. He had a month. He sat at the table. Hyunja came to stand at his shoulder. He knows, she said. He knows something, he said. He doesn't know what. Is there a difference? He thought about this honestly. There's a month of difference, he said. Which is enough. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, when you came here, we had 40 grams of flour in a child who couldn't stand up. Yes. And now? He looked at the room. At Pavlo at the window, still watching the street. At Suwa, who was braiding cord at the table's edge with the unconscious competence of someone who had been doing it long enough that her hands did it independently. At Jiho, asleep on the stove, his breathing even and full and not the breathing of the first week in any way. At the room that was the same room, same walls, same smoke-blackened ceiling, same cracked window glass, and was entirely different from the room he had woken up in. Now we have a month, he said. And a network. And a storage pit and 4 households in terrain that we know better than anyone who will come to assess it. He looked at the window. At the wet spring street. The first arc is over, he said. We survived it. We're visible now, we can't go back to being invisible. So the next thing isn't about hiding. What is it about, she said. He thought about the district assessment. About the surveying cart. About Cheol-su's expression, not anger, something more complicated. About 15 people across 4 households who had spent a month learning how to read terrain and build systems and keep their faces still. About a widow who had been a teacher. About an old midwife who knew which clay held a wall and which sandy soil failed. About a 17-year-old boy who had learned to set a snare in frozen ground and check it without leaving a print trail. It's about whether what we've built is deep enough to survive being seen, he said. He looked at Pavlo one more time. The boy was watching a second bird land on the fence post. His face had the expression of someone for whom a bird landing on a fence post was, at this specific moment, exactly enough. Outside, the spring mud was drying at the edges. In the orchard, the snare lines were running. In the embankment, the storage pit held 2 weeks of reserve. In 3 other houses, people were doing the same quiet, invisible work. The first arc was finished. The second one had already begun.